Hi there, and welcome to our first Run Lab webinar. We are just getting settled here. Lauren, you got a chair? All right, so my name's Dr. Kim Davis, and I'm the founder and CEO of Run Lab, and I'm here with Lauren Wilson.
Howdy, howdy.
And we just launched a podcast recently, and so we figured we would both want to be on this webinar so you guys get a little bit familiar with who we are and a little bit about the company. So we'll get right into things. We're going to talk today about whether there is really a right way to run or not, and kind of what our philosophy is on that, and a little bit about what we do here at Run Lab. And let's get right into things. A little bit about what the company is. So we're based here in Austin, Texas, and we've got a couple of brick and mortar locations here. And then we do motion analysis and gait diagnostic work. So we help people understand the way that they move. We help them understand their full body structure and range of motion. We do strength testing, and we look at all of these variables before we even look at them move. And then after we assess all of that stuff, we go into the gait side of things, and we film runners from a bunch of different directions, both shoes and barefoot. And then we put all of that data together, and we create a big report that breaks everything down, that helps the runner understand kind of what's going right, what's going wrong, what they need to work on to get better. And then also help them understand a little bit about their own unique structure and things that you can't change about your body. And we're going to talk about that stuff today and why that matters, because it's a really important part both of what we do as a company, but also to become better as a runner, more efficient, less injury prone. You want to understand how your structural variables play into that. So that's what we do in a nutshell. We also launched something this last year called Run Lab US, which allows people to upload their videos of all of this structure and range of motion data and gait information to us. And then we analyze them from here. We do a phone call and a Zoom meeting where we help you understand what all of that data looks like, and then give you a report. And the same thing that you would get if you were here in Austin. And then you can take that back to your favorite home PT or trainer or coach, and they can work from that report to help you without having to really do the diagnostic work on the front end for the gait side, since that's really what we do and that's really our niche. So again, we're really a diagnostic company for about dealing with motion analysis. And then here we, if you live in the Austin area, we can also handle the gait retraining, physical therapy. If you're injured, we can deal with running injuries here in the clinic. We have an elite running team, a bunch of guys that are Olympic trials qualifiers, all the way from marathon to track athletes. We have a special needs running team. One of our biggest messages and platforms as a company is that we really feel like everybody should be able to run, and biomechanics are biomechanics. It's just specific to the person. And so we have an entire running team of kids with Down syndrome, and we've worked with people with cerebral palsy and MS and all kinds of movement disorders and things. And so it's a really cool thing to help people be able to run and move and get out there into the world, no matter what level you're at. So it's we're a very inclusive company. And I just want to lead this off too by saying that if you have to pop off before we get done today, we'll be following up with you guys with some information after the webinar is over, and you're welcome to email us if you have any questions, because I know I talk fast and we're going to throw a lot of information out at you. And at the end of the day, I just want you to kind of take home the big picture message that there's really that everybody's built very uniquely, and you have to understand your own body in order to move as efficiently as possible. So that's a little bit about us as a company. Lauren, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll talk a little bit about where I came from.
Awesome. Yeah. My name's Lauren Wilson. I grew up in Boerne, Texas, where I was fortunate enough to be a part of a really good team. I had a great community, a great coach. So I ended up getting a track scholarship to run at the University of Texas. After I left the University of Texas, or graduated from UT with a degree in exercise science, I really got the bug or the itch just to really help people through fitness, because I just believe being healthy and practicing wellness is just going to lead to a better overall quality of life, and no matter what factor you're going through, whether that's relationships, work, etc. So I got as many certifications as I could, the NSCA, CSCS, NASM. I'm a certified yoga instructor. I was a running coach. I worked with individuals with Parkinson's disease, with senior citizens, and just worked with a wide variety of people. So again, just really very passionate about helping people. But in that same sense, what I got kind of into my own chronic injury cycle, And that was why I kind of fell in love with Run Lab and what we do here at Run Lab. After I left UT, I just went through about 5 or 6 years where I was getting hurt all the time. And it was kind of frustrating because I had all these different certifications and I was helping all these other people, but I wasn't able to really help myself so much. I would get to a certain volume or a certain intensity level and I would just get hurt. And so when I met Dr. Davis and she taught me about Run Lab and she taught me about looking at people's unique structure, unique movement patterns, I really was able to apply those own principles to myself. And I've been able to stay injury free over the past 2 years. And over the past 2 years, I've really gone back into running. And more specifically, I've gotten into ultra running. So I just kind of backtrack a little bit. I ran the LA Marathon back in 2010, and I ran a 2:37, which is a 5:59 per mile pace. And then that was kind of when I got into that chronic injury cycle, and I wasn't able to get out of it until I got back into the environment at Run Lab. Went through this process, this gait retraining, and this movement pattern, and I was able to get healthy, run my first 100-mile race last September. I ran it in 17 hours and 30 minutes, which was under the course record for the Flagstaff to Grand Canyon Stagecoach Line 100. It placed me in the top 100 for individuals in the 100-mile distance within the United States. And the good thing about that is I didn't get hurt during the buildup. I didn't get hurt at all during the training buildup. And then I was able to really bounce back after that race as well. I came back 8 weeks later and I was a part of the Run Lab Elite team at the Circus, which is a 12-hour relay where each person just kind of hands off, runs a 5-mile leg, hands off to the next person, waits till the other 3 people run. And we were able to break 100 miles for that 12-hour relay race and earn free entry for life into that race. And I ended up, some of the guys kind of rolled their ankles on the trail. So I ended up running 32 miles that day at about sub 7-minute mile pace through just mud up to my shins. So it was a pretty epic day. And then again, that was just 8 weeks later, then recovered from that, ran the Boston Marathon this past April in 2:37 again. So 9 years later, I was almost able to PR on that marathon. And I've just been getting healthier and healthier and able to run the Spectrum Sky Island 50K this past weekend. And I'm gearing up for the Brazos Bend 100 December 7th. So that's me.
Awesome. Thanks, man. So that's a little bit about Lauren. I came from kind of the opposite side. I didn't run as a kid at all. I was a trumpet player, started running in, I guess I was 28 or so when I started getting into running, and I gotten into it because I was taking up triathlon. I wanted to just do a triathlon. And if any of you guys are triathletes, you know that that's a slippery slope, but you drink the Kool-Aid as soon as you've done your first one, and all of a sudden you're signing up for Ironmans and all kinds of things you never thought you'd do. So that was me. And as I was increasing my running mileage to train for triathlon, I was getting injured just over and over and over again. I was super frustrated with it. I was in chiropractic school at the time. I'm a chiropractor, and I couldn't really find anybody to help me. I knew it was something about the way that I was running that was causing all these injuries, because I would get rid of one and then I would get another one that would pop up, and it was so frustrating. But I couldn't find anybody to really help me. So I thought, I can probably help myself just by learning all of this stuff I'm learning in school and diving into the biomechanics realm. So that's what I did. And I was really able to solve all of my own stuff with the exception of this one kind of long lasting knee issue that happened because of a trauma on a bike. And fast forward 5 or 6 years later, still doing triathlons and really into the running scene at that point, and really wanted to get this knee thing figured out. So ended up in an orthopedist office, and the conversation went something like this. Kim, let's do an MRI on your knee. Okay, great. Get me back in the office. We sit down, we look at the report, and he says, well, there's really nothing structurally wrong with your knee. What you really need to do is stop running, because running is very bad for your knees. And I thought, this is a total horseshit answer, because there was no talk about the way that I was running and the fact that running was really at that point the only thing that would flare it up. And there was no discussion about maybe we should look at the way that you're moving, and that could be causing some of this issue. So that was the day that I realized that we really needed a different spin on the healthcare system when we're dealing with athletes and runners. And I knew that I had solved all of my own other stuff and I could solve this too. And so I went deeper into the biomechanics realm and just poured myself into it and was able to solve that knee issue for good. I haven't had an injury that has kept me from running in at least 5, if not 6 or 7 years. I ran every single day last year and every day of this year. And I run 60 to 80 miles a week. I've done 12 to 72-hour adventure races. I've done 4 Ironmans, all of that stuff completely injury free. And I attribute it entirely to the fact that I finally dug in and worked on my biomechanics. Because again, I wasn't a talented runner as a kid, anything like that. I just ran my first 1856 5K this last year, as a 42-year-old. So not bad for somebody who didn't run as a kid. And more importantly, the injury-free aspect. So anyway, enough about us, but just wanted to give you some background so you understand why we do this and why this business ever came to be. It was because I want to help people and help people get to, running into their golden years without injury. And that's a big part of why we have the business. So great. All right, let's get into this. So what do we want to look like when we run? So when you think about efficient running mechanics, you think of the Kenyans, right? Like you think of these marathon runners, and if you look at their hip extension, you can see that their back legs are really far out behind them, and they're pretty straight, and they've got all this hip extension, and they've got this knee drive in the front. Their hips are really big and open, and they are coming way off the ground when they're in flight phase. And so this is sort of what we think of when we think of ideal running form when you're sort of across a distance population. But when you go to any old regular race and what do we actually look like, right? So this is us. And if you look at this little population here, what you start to see is lots of knee braces, lots of overly flexed ankles and overly extended knees, people that are landing with really straight legs, which puts a lot of stress on them. People that clearly just look unhappy in general that they're even out there. So what happens? Why is this the case? And this is what we try to look at in this clinic, is helping people understand why they look more like this and less like the last slide that we looked at. So to get all on the same page, it's important to very quickly understand a couple of things about biomechanics as far as the gait cycle goes. And so we're going to break this down so you understand how we talk about it in this clinic. And basically there's 4, you can break this down infinitely, and there are a lot of ways that people in the world talk about breaking down the gait cycle, but here's how we do it at Run Lab. At least these are the basic ones for you guys to understand. We break it down further when we analyze videos. But when the foot first makes contact with the ground, that's called foot strike. And that can be, if you've done research on running, you probably know there's heel striking, there's midfoot striking, there's forefoot striking. Those are the kind of the basic ways people talk about foot strike. So that's when the foot first makes contact. And then as the body continues to move forward over that planted foot and you start to absorb shock from the ground, your foot goes flat onto the ground or the treadmill, and this is mid stance. And this position is basically the point when the body is fully loaded over that planted foot. So you go flying through the air, you crash into the ground, you make contact, you load your body over that planted foot. This is when you absorb shock, and then you see your body continues to move forward until you start to push backward. You're pushing yourself forward and you're pushing backward on the ground. This is push off. And so this is the point when you're basically starting to propel yourself. So these first couple of slides are the shock absorption portion where you're loading and you're absorbing shock from the ground. If you are injured, you usually have problem in this area, either in contact, in initial loading, or in mid stance. Your body doesn't load well. And so that's something we deal with in our business, is if you're injured, we got to work on this part of the gait cycle. If you're somebody who's not necessarily injured, but you're not as fast as you want to be, this next part comes into play. So push off, the propulsion portion. And then as the foot leaves the ground, you enter swing phase. So you can see here, Rory's foot starts to, as soon as it leaves the ground, it flies upward for a sec, and then it starts to move forward, and then it comes back down towards the ground. So you've got an initial swing, you've got mid swing where the foot comes this way, and then back towards the ground is terminal swing. So again, it's contact, mid stance, push off, and then swing phase. So this is a really important point to understand too, is pronation versus supination and why they're important and how these play into the gait cycle. So there is a lot of misinformation out there in the world about pronation and supination. If you've been into a shoe store and they've told you you're an overpronator, you have heard the antiquated terminology. So to explain what pronation actually is, pronation it's complex. So it happens in all three planes. So you've got three planes, we're three-dimensional. There is movement in the foot and ankle that happens in all three of those planes to create pronation and to create supination. But as far as what you need to know without going way deep into biomechanics is that pronation creates a flexible foot. And so that allows, as your foot moves into contact phase, it allows your foot to absorb shock from the ground and transfer that shock up the kinetic chain so your muscles can absorb it the way they're supposed to. If your foot doesn't pronate, that means you're not absorbing shock appropriately. The problem is oftentimes people pronate for too long and they never get back into supination. So supination is just the opposite. It makes your foot rigid, and you want your foot to be rigid during that propulsion phase. Remember that push-off phase we just showed you? You don't want to push off of a squishy, marshmallowy foot. You want to push off of a rigid lever. So if your foot doesn't resupinate, that's when you run into problems. But you need both of these biomechanical movements to move through the gait cycle efficiently. And it's very important for shock absorption that your foot pronates. And so again, when you go into a shoe store and they say you're an overpronator, there's really no such thing. It matters much more that you get back into supination. If you could pronate a ton, and as long as you move back into supination, that is totally okay and normal for your body. So now people can have weakness problems in their foot and ankle that allow them to stay stuck in pronation longer than they should, but that's a separate issue. And that's also not typically something that is solved by a shoe. So this is just something to kind of wrap your head around and understand as we go through this. And also just to throw in there, sorry about the background noise. We're in an active clinic, so if it's a little loud in the background, there's people doing stuff back there behind us doing rehab. Okay, so real quick, running versus walking. So there's a couple of things to understand. So when somebody is running, in this picture here, this second picture, and then this last picture, this fourth picture, Lucas is running. So during mid stance, remember that position where you're fully loaded over your foot. This is mid stance running. And I want you to notice his body position. He's very low. Look at his head. So this first picture here is mid stance during walking. This is mid stance running. This is mid stance walking. Look at his head position. So one of the things that happens with running is it almost is like a mass spring effect where you go flying through the air and then you collapse in and then you explode outward. On walking, your body moves upward when you move into mid stance, like an inverted pendulum. It's the opposite motion from running. And this matters. I'll tell you why it matters here on the next slide. But just notice that. And then one of the other things that's important to notice is that during walking, this picture here, this third picture, you have a point when both feet are on the ground, and you never have that when you run. So when you run, you have a flight phase with both feet off the ground that you never have when you walk. But this double stance phase here creates a lot of stability in walking that you don't have when you run, because you get this point when both feet are on the ground, and you never have that when you run. One of the other issues is that you spend more time on the ground with walking than you do with running. So you spend somewhere around 60% of your time with your foot actually on the ground during a gait cycle with walking, and it's reversed in running. So you're only spending about 40% of your time on the ground, which again makes it a less stable activity because you're spending more time flying through the air and then having to land and absorb all of that shock. So you need a lot of eccentric muscle strength to be able to absorb that appropriately. So those are a couple of things, running versus walking, and why this matters. So check out this little video. So when we bring people into the clinic, this is one of the shots we get. We'll get a view of them running from the side with their shoes, and then we'll look at them barefoot and do all these views. But basically, this one is interesting because you look at this guy and you think, okay, he's running, and you see a lot of people that run like this, especially if you go out to Ironmans. I always call this the Ironman shuffle because this is somebody sprinting as a triathlete, right? So I've done them, so I understand how this goes. Anyway, so when you look at him run, though, what you really can't tell until we slow him down and actually look at his mechanics is that he's technically not actually running. He's actually just walking really fast. So he's not getting both feet off the ground. He never gets into a flight phase. And see how extended his knee is here when he lands and how flexed his ankle is. That creates a lot of stress at the anterior knee joint, a lot of stress at the ankle, lots of issues in general, because in his mind, he's running. And here's the other issue that's complicating is that notice his mid stance phase. So during mid stance, he's actually at his lowest position, matching running biomechanics. So during mid stance, he's basically got running biomechanics, but during contact, he's got walking biomechanics. So you can imagine the body is challenged by that. It's sort of confusing in how you deal with it. And there's a lot of torsional stress and things that happen to accommodate for the fact that he's not necessarily in one bucket or the other. So one of the things we encourage people to do, and we work with in the clinic a lot, is when you go out for a run, get into one bucket or the other. It's much better for you to walk and sort of reset your biomechanics for a short stint and then go run and make sure that when you're running, you're truly running and getting a flight phase, and then take another walk break to reset. That's a much better way to train your body to be efficient and to ultimately increase your metabolism and everything else than it is to go and just slog through the miles. And I've done this too when I started. I know, you've got this mileage on your calendar and you think I got to go out and do it and get through my 5 miles or my 10 miles or my 20 miles or whatever it is. But your biomechanics suffer from that if you're not truly getting into the running bucket. So this is something, again, we work on with people a lot in the clinic, and it's just something you can kind of take home with you and start thinking about. So yay feet. These are amazing feet. So here's what we want to talk about in this little set of slides. This is probably the most important thing about this entire presentation. And that is that structure matters. And structure is something, when you talk about structural versus functional in a human body, structure is something that you can't change about yourself. It's the way that your bones are built and put together. It's the way that you were born. So when you have something that is structural, you have to know about it because it's going to affect the way that you function and the way that you move, which is why there's no right way to run, right? Because everybody is built so differently from one another. Not only do you have different structural variables, you have different range of motion in all your different muscles in your body. You have different strengths. You have all kinds of different things from the person next to you. So there's an efficient way for you to move as a human in your own unique body, but not necessarily a right way across a population. So when we look at this guy, here's a couple examples. And these are functional things that have developed, but now they've become structural, that he can't necessarily change. It's something like a bunion. So a bunion is when your body is put under load, it builds. So when a bone is put under load, it builds more bone. And one of the things contributing to a bunion is that there is stress going into this medial toe joint, which is going to create more shoring up of that joint and more bone development around this metatarsal phalangeal joint. So there are a few things that can cause bunions, and they don't know exactly why they always form, but there are definitely some things that contribute. And if you think about stress going down into this medial toe joint, some of that can come from things like weak hips, because if your hip is weak and you try to stand on one leg, if you've ever tried to do a one-legged squat and you have a little weaker hip, you'll know that your knee kind of dives in. Well, all that stress goes down into your foot. And so if you're doing that every time you run, because remember, you never have two legs on the ground when you run, you only ever have one. So you're essentially doing one-legged hop after one-legged hop. If you have weak hips and you're not able to stabilize, a lot of stress goes into this medial toe joint. So bunions can get worse from that sort of thing. A couple other things you notice are black toenails and calluses and these curled up sort of hammer toe situation. All of those things, if you were to walk into a shoe store, the first thing that they would do is put you in a bigger shoe, right? Because they would say, oh, you're hitting the end of your shoe. But here's another issue, and we see this all the time in the clinic. If somebody has weak hips, again, or is unstable in their ankles or anywhere else in their body, if you try to stand on one leg barefoot, you grip the ground and you push your toes into the ground trying to grip and stabilize. Well, if you're doing that because you have instability up the kinetic chain while you run, you're of course gripping the inside of your shoe. You just can't tell because you can't see it. So this can cause that same issue. You can get calluses and you can get black toenails and you can get all of these things and these curled toes, these flexed tendons in the bottom of the foot because you're trying to stabilize your unstable upper body. Well, if you imagine if somebody has this issue and they go into a shoe store and they get put in an even bigger shoe, they're swimming around in that thing and that increases the instability problems even more. So really understanding not only structural stuff, but also kind of where your strengths and weaknesses are is important because you want to be able to self-advocate. You don't want to go into a shoe store and just kind of say, oh, I've got this issue, and they put you in a bigger shoe and all of a sudden you're having all kinds of problems that are even worse. So this is just stuff to be thinking about. And then when you talk about structural issues, this is a really, really common one, and it relates back to the feet here in just a second. But if you look at genu valgum, which means basically knock knees. So if you look at a really extreme example, this is a really extreme example, and this is a more common, less extreme example. But if you look at where the stress is, look at this inside joint line right here. See this big, thick black area? That's meniscus. And so this has been worn down because this person has has genu valgum structurally. So over time, they're going to have stress here that somebody who has neutral knees doesn't have. And again, everybody's got structural variables. You have stress and load in areas just naturally, you're going to have them. Nobody's built perfectly where there's no stress anywhere. We just have to understand where your specific load is so that we can accommodate for that. So somebody with genu valgum, or any degree of knock knees is going to have a little bit of extra stress on the inside knee, as you can imagine, on the inside ankle, a little bit at the hip, and sometimes at the low back. But anyway, what I want you to notice is if you think about whether somebody who has these types of knees is going to have a more flat foot or a more rigid foot, you can probably come to the assumption that because this force is being pushed down in since the time they're born, that their foot's going to develop a little more flatly than somebody who has neutral knees, which is exactly what happens. So they tend to have feet that look a little more like this. And if you remember back to our pronation versus supination comment a little while ago, a flatter, more flexible foot is a more pronated foot just naturally. But here's the problem. If a flat pronated foot goes into a shoe store, what does the shoe store do? Oftentimes they want to put you in a stability shoe or something with an arch support. They want to give you an arch. Well, here's the problem. If you think about what that does to the knee joint, if you were to put an arch in under this flat foot, it's pushing that inside of that bone even further up into that knee joint where this person already has joint line decrease and problems. So you might feel okay at the foot and ankle level, and the shoe store guys might say, oh man, look at how we've made your foot not roll in anymore. Like, this is great. You're not pronating anymore. But the problem is somebody with this kind of structural variable needs to be able to have a pronated foot because that's the way that their knee sits in the most neutral position. So you don't want to increase stress here over time just by putting an arch support that's trying to solve for something that shouldn't be solved for, because it's not a problem. It's the way the person was born. So again, just be thinking about structural stuff. And if you look at the opposite side of the spectrum, a lot of guys and some women, but more guys than girls, have this genu varum, which is the opposite of genu valgum. It's kind of a knock knee situation. And they have the opposite situation with their feet. They tend to have more pronated, more rigid feet. So they're really good at propulsion, but they're not so good at shock absorption. So we have to help them find a shoe that works on the shock absorption part so that they're not, because they can't do it very well with their body. And again, these guys are just going to have excess load at places that people who have genu valgum don't necessarily struggle with. So they're going to have, if you look at what lives out here on the outside of the knee, out here, that's the IT band, right? So this is put on a lot of stretch, just structurally, just naturally, the way that the person's built. So a lot of these guys have IT band issues. They'll get tibial stress fractures and things because a lot of rotation has to happen to get that medial toe onto the ground. You can even see kind of that they put a lot of stress on the outside metatarsals because that's just where they bear weight because of the way they're built. So again, these are all just sort of things that you need to look at on yourself and understand, how does this affect the way that you move, and how is your body structurally different from the person next to you. Retroverted hips is something that is, there's a sort of a functional, so retroverted hips means that the hip turns out and it turns out in the socket. So there's a structural variable where the hip is actually physically turned out in the socket a little bit, and it'll cause something that looks like this, where the feet just turn out when you're non-weight bearing, basically. And then there's sort of a functional retroversion too, where you have tight muscles on the backside that are pulling that hip outward. And so there are ways that you can figure out whether it's structural or functional. One of the things that you can do, and you'll usually know if you've tried to squat over your lifetime and you have a hard time doing what this guy in the left picture is doing, where you turn your feet basically straight forward and squat to 90 degrees or more. If that's always been a problem position for you, but you do a lot better when you turn your legs out, there's at least a likelihood that you've got a little bit of retroversion in your hips. And there's something called anteversion, which is the opposite, which is more the pigeon-toed kind of look. And it's the same thing. If your hip sits either inward or outward in the socket, just naturally, structurally, if you're trying to turn your feet straight ahead when you walk or run or squat, you're putting that hip under stress and aberrant load over time, especially with a repetitive motion activity like running, which over time can give you a lot of problems. And the problem with the fitness industry is a lot of trainers and coaches out there don't understand this concept. And so they tell everyone to squat, run, walk with your feet facing forward. And we end up with a ton of people in the clinic who are injured because they don't, you don't know, you think you're supposed to, you don't want to look funny when you run. Your buddy's like, you look really weird when you run, you turn your feet in. But if you do that and you have a structural variable like this in your hip, it can cause a lot of problems. So again, sort of a little self-test that we use with people who aren't in the clinic or just kind of trying to figure it out on the fly. If you can try this, where you try to squat with your feet facing forward and then try facing out. And if that's a lot easier for you, then there's a little, at least a chance you've got some retroversion. You can also face your feet in and try the same thing. If you're somebody who can sit cross-legged, but you can't sit with your feet inward and sort of W sit, then that's also another little test. And basically, if you stand and if you stand straight up and you turn your feet all the way in and then all the way out, like a ballet dancer, you should have about the same amount of range of motion outward as you do inward. And if you have a significant difference between one or the other, like 30 degrees more one way than the other, then there's a chance that you've got some either anaversion or retroversion. And again, people can help you figure this out. You don't have to do this on your own. You can go into clinics that can help you understand it, but it's just something to be thinking about if you've always struggled with certain positions with squatting. Okay, so just real quickly, and we won't take too long, but let's talk about, and then we'll take a couple questions at the end we've got coming in. But let's get through these last few slides, and then we'll go into that so that people can pop off that need to go. So a couple little running myths that we see in the clinic a lot that tend to slow people down. So stretching is beneficial for your running. So this is a pretty hot topic. I'm sure that you guys have all read something or another about stretching being good or bad. You should never do it. You should always do it. When should you do it? So here's the thing to understand about stretching. And this is a whole topic and probably a whole webinar all in itself. But basically, the more length you create in a muscle, the less stable that muscle is going to be. So you want enough length in your muscles to be able to go through a normal gait cycle, but you don't want more range of motion than you need around that joint, or that joint is going to have to create more work for the muscles around it to try to stabilize it. So stretching also, unless you're spending at least 3 to 4 minutes in a pose and stretching that muscle for that long, you're not going to have long-term therapeutic benefit. Basically, the muscle will go right back to its normal length once you take the stretch away. So most people are not spending 3 or 4 minutes, unless you're in yoga, doing these stretches anyway. So it's not having much long-term benefit. It feels good, but the better thing to do prior to a type of movement that requires a lot of stability, like running, is a dynamic warm-up. And a dynamic warm-up means that you're warming up the muscles using the actual type of movement that you're about to engage in. So things like A skips and B skips, if you've ever been in the track world, and if you haven't, those are things you can Google very easily and understand how to do. Warming up with A skips and B skips is a really good way to warm the muscles up and not create extra length. Foam rolling is great because you're not creating more length in the muscle. You're kind of getting the crap out of it and working through some of the adhesions so the muscle can work properly and get blood flow to the area, but you're not creating more length. So dynamic warm-ups are a lot better way to go than stretching. Okay, this is a really important one to understand. So most runners, if they were given one muscle to stretch for the rest of their lives, they would choose hamstrings. And I don't know where this all came from or why we think we need to do this, but if you think about how much range of motion you actually need in your hamstring when you run, unless you're a hurdler, you never take your foot or your leg straight out in front of you, right? So we're doing all these hamstring stretches to create all this length in our hamstrings, and yet we don't really need that much length to go through a normal gait cycle. Even sprinters, they don't need to be able to go to 90 degrees. So here's the problem: is that we as humans now, in the way that we live, we sit all the time. And so we get very, very tight in the front of our bodies. So our hip flexors and the quad that crosses the hip, rectus femoris, that tends to get very tight. So if you look at this side view of the pelvis, there's this quad and hip flexor that attaches on the front side. And then here's the hamstring on the back side. So they're antagonists of each other. And you see they pull opposite directions on the pelvis. So imagine, with all this time we spend sitting, how short and tight these front muscles get. And we sit at computers, we drive, we lay on our sides when we sleep, we ride bikes. Everything that we're doing is in flexion for the most part. And so what happens is, over time, that those hip flexors are pulling forward on the pelvis, which then pulls upward. See this point right here? This is the insertion point in the hamstring. It's pulling up on that. So what happens? So people then feel like their hamstring is tight. They're like, oh man, I feel it up in my glutes, like my hamstring is just so tight. So they'll go and stretch it. But what has actually happened? You've created tension in this front muscle, and you've already created more length in this hamstring because of the pelvis rotation. So you can see, as this thing pulls upward on the hamstring insertion, that muscle gets longer and longer and longer over time. So then if you go stretch it more because you're feeling tension up there, it's just compounding the problem. So it's really important to understand that the stretching and the range of motion work and the massage work and things, more often than not, you're going to have a lot higher payoff doing work on the front of the body and leaving that hamstring alone. A lot of times people actually need more strength back here than they need flexibility. The last point on this slide too is, look at what this does to the lower back. So this lower back gets put into extension, lordosis, and all these little muscles up here get short and tight too. So distance runners who have this imbalance oftentimes find themselves struggling with low back pain issues, especially later in a run as their form falls apart and their pelvis starts to rotate even more. Hamstring starts to give them problems because they're feeling this tug, and then low back gives issues too. So this is just a really, really, really common problem in in our running population because of how much sitting we do. So just know that if you're having hamstring issues or low back issues, a lot of times that's not the problem area. And you can rub on that and get massage and get PT and all these things. And if it's not solving it, there's probably something else going on that's a little deeper. And then the other thing that can cause issues, especially in the low back, is weak hips. And we talked about this earlier. When you have a weak hip, this kind of illustrates it. So see, if this person is weak in this hip, it's not holding the side of the pelvis down. It's not keeping it level and stable. So when this weak hip is weak, this glute medius, this hip side, this left side drops down. Well, as that happens, see how the knee dives inward and then the foot dives inward too. So this is something that can cause problems at the knee. You can see how she's leaning to the right to try to stabilize over that hip. So she can end up having low back pain because of that. Medial knee pain, medial ankle pain, all kinds of problems. This girl also has a weak hip, but she's compensating in a different way. So her foot actually, as it goes through swing phase, this hip is not being stabilized. So it swings across midline and ends up landing way across midline. So you see how she's not even touching her medial foot to the ground when she lands. So she's coming across midline. And in order to compensate for that, look at how much her body rotates. So see how she's almost looking to the right. Her entire upper body is rotated that way. So she can get problems with her low back, hip, IT band, all kinds of issues from stuff like this. But again, all that's coming from weak hips. And if you haven't had an analysis to understand that that's where the problem is, you can chase these issues around all day long and not really solve anything. Real quick on Rory. So you saw him earlier. He's one of our elite guys, and he's an Olympic trials marathoner, Olympic trials qualifier in the marathon, super fast, efficient runner. And he was having some low back issues. When we looked at his gait, look at how his left side comes across midline and his right side doesn't. So he's very neutral and looks good on this side. This one was coming across. So when we looked at the back side, this is his. So this bottom picture is his kind of normal side, his good side, his strong side. And if you look at what he looks like from the back, look how straight he is. Pelvis is leveled, no rotation in the upper body. Then you come to his weaker side and see how it comes across. This is how he compensates for it by leaning and rotating his body. So he was getting low back and hip issues because he was coming across midline. So once we solved that, some of the other stuff got taken care of. This one is a big one too. So heel striking is bad. So heel striking is not bad. Please get this out of your mind. Don't think about it as something that's bad. Heel striking is a type of foot strike that loads a specific part of the body. And that may be good or bad depending on whether you have strength in that part of the body. And it's the same thing for foot strike. It's the same thing for midfoot strike. Forefoot strike and midfoot strike. So wherever you land, it just loads a different part of the body. And again, that might be good or bad depending on where your strengths and weaknesses are. So with heel striking, so Will Nation is a elite marathoner as well, Olympic trials qualifier. And he lands on his heel. So does Dina Castor. She lands on her heel. She's Olympic silver medalist. So these guys we're not going to change their foot strike. They're super efficient runners. But here's what I want you to notice. Their heel strike, they land with a bent knee. Okay, so see how the knee here is bent? When you look at somebody landing with a straight leg, that's where we run into problems. So heel striking is not the problem. It's the overstride. It's when you land on your heel and also have a straight knee. That's when you run into injuries. So don't be under the impression that landing on your heel is bad. It's not about landing on your heel. It's the landing on the heel with a straight knee that's the problem, and that's called an overstride. So overstriding is bad. Heel striking is not bad. I think the last one we have is strength training and gait training are the same thing. So it's important to understand that this is not the case either. So strength training works on the actual brute strength of the muscle, the ability of the muscle to actually tolerate a load. Gait training is teaching that muscle how to work efficiently under repetitive motion. So once that muscle is strong, you want to be able to teach it how to not fatigue and how to work repetitively in a sport like running over and over and over again without falling apart and without getting unstable, because that's when injuries happen. So if you think about strength training and gait training, if everybody that was strong was efficient, if that's what it was, if it translated into efficient movement to be strong, these guys are winning marathons, right? And I know there's some CrossFitters and some guys out there that are boot camp people, so not to offend anyone, but these guys they can carry a tree trunk across a field, but they can't necessarily win a marathon. Who's winning a marathon? These goofy little 110-pound kids that like can't touch their toes, and they can't do so. But it's because they've trained their body to be really efficient in this movement pattern, and they have strength for that type of movement pattern. So you need both. You need the strength and you need the gait training so that your body can use that strength efficiently and work through the motion without putting excess load in areas that can't tolerate it. So that's a really important piece of the puzzle. So really the take home message, and again, we could talk about this for days and days and days and days. We go into a lot more of this stuff on our podcast. So if you want to check us out there, it's called Run, and it's on Spotify, and it's also on iTunes. We just launched it, so we've only got a couple episodes on there. But in any case, the big take home message, and we'll do more of these in the future to do a little deeper dive on this stuff, but structure is the most important thing to understand about your body. If you understand the way that you're built from the ground up, you can start to extrapolate how your range of motion plays into that, and whether you need to pronate a little more than somebody else, and whether your hamstring range of motion and your hip range of motion is at play in this whole thing. Just all of that stuff matters. So looking at your structure first, and then understanding your range of motion, your strengths and limiters, your body specific to you as a human, and then how that translates into the most efficient type of movement for you. And then incorporating strength work is really important to get stronger, but also gait training to be more efficient. And the frontal plane stability is really important, because as runners, we do a lot of stuff in the sagittal plane. So basically moving forward, we're not doing a lot of sagittal, we're not doing a lot of frontal sort of side to side motion. So that's a really important piece of the puzzle in getting stronger as a runner too, to be able to stabilize your hips, is doing frontal plane motion. And one way you can do that is trail running. Trail running is awesome because you're still getting to run, but you're doing a lot of side to side motion, and it's going to challenge your muscles in a way that they're not used to being challenged when you're out on the road. And the other thing I'd recommend is switching out shoes, because that don't always run in the same shoes all the time, because that challenges your foot and your body and the muscles in your feet a little differently with each run. So other than that, this is the real take home message. Don't be this guy. I love too that he's got like Nike Frees and double knee braces. So don't be that guy. Anyway, so our process, just real quick, the way things work. If you're in Austin, you can give us a call at 266-1000 and we'll get you set up. We take insurance for everything we do locally. If you're not in our area, you can still work with us, and it's a real easy process. We teach you how to upload your videos and tell you what we need from you, and then you'll upload it through our uploader, and we'll send you the same big report, and we'll send you the same video report finding and talk to you about your structure and your range of motion and your strength and your gait and all that fun stuff, kind of what you need to do to get better. And then I think that is all we have. Lauren, did you want to handle some questions?
I'm still here, people.
Sorry, I talked.
Yeah, so before, we did have a question come through, but we're going to answer that, we promise. Before that, we do have a special going on. So anyone that goes to our website today and purchases a movement analysis profile will receive $50 off. And then anyone who purchases a movement analysis profile September 27th through September 30th will receive $25 off. And we're going to be sending out an email after this webinar with the codes and the instructions to take advantage of that opportunity. So go ahead and figure it out today.
Yeah, it's awesome. You guys will love it. I mean, really, and normally the price is $199, just FYI. And again, if you're in the Austin area, just call us and we can get you in and bill your insurance for it. So we're at 266-1000. Our question: retroverted hips, is this common for postpartum after pregnancy runners? So that is actually a really good question. So what happens with post-pregnancy is you've stretched out all these ligaments around your pelvis. And so it's not that retroverted hips specifically is something that is always going to happen, or that is more common than anything else around the pelvis, but there is a lot of flexibility that you'll have now around the pelvis and the hip that wasn't there before. And so what can happen is, in order to try to stabilize all of that flexibility around the hip, the glutes and the muscles that surround that hip joint will tighten up, because they tighten to try to stabilize. Because if you think about every time you walk or run, if you're loose, if you think about your muscles like a spring, if you were to pull that spring and stretch it out and then try to land on it, it's going to be all over the place and unstable. So that's what your muscles are like. And if your body and your joints are like, and if you land on that unstable joint, the muscles around it are going to work really hard to try to stabilize and tighten up. Well, if that happens, that can start to pull the hip outward into kind of a retroverted position. So it's not necessarily that the pregnancy or the stretching or the expanding of the pelvis or the stretching of the ligaments cause that retroversion, but it can certainly happen because of these imbalances that you develop if you don't get right on the hip stability work following pregnancy. So during pregnancy is the best time to do it. And obviously, that's ship has sailed, sounds like on, probably your situation, but also many people. So if you haven't worked on it while you're pregnant, afterwards is the second best time. So start doing single leg stuff. So single leg stability work is the best thing. If I could pick one exercise to do, it would be single leg stability work. And that can take many forms. It can be anything from just standing on one leg and teaching your body how to squat, all the way to doing a single leg box jump down to the floor, back up. So doing a depth jump to a box jump and stringing these movements together. All of that stuff. The more you can do on one leg, though, the more strength that you're going to build for running motion. Because remember, you're only ever on one leg during running. So you have to mimic that movement pattern when you're training your body so that it's efficient when you actually take it into the functional movement of running. So that's I think that hopefully answers that question. If you guys have any other questions, you're welcome to email us. We'll be sending out information after this webinar about how to get a hold of us. And please join us because we will be doing more of these down the road. Also, if you have ideas, if there's something you want us to talk about, please send us those as well. Follow our podcast and you can check us out at runlab.us. And thank you guys for your time.
Later.